My guest today, Dr. Andrew White, is a research archaeologist for the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. He is an educator, and he also shines the white-hot light of scrutiny on pseudoarchaeology. Dr. White, it's good to have you, man.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, let's do definitions. Pseudoarchaeology, what do you mean?
So archaeology is the study of the human past through material remains. Pseudoarchaeology wants to appear to be addressing those same kinds of questions, but they don't actually use any method that I would say is science, but they like to appear as if they're science. So it's not just bad science, it is fake science, and that's where the pseudo comes in.
It's not just somebody being lazy or connecting the dots in a wrong way. Is this purposeful? Like with agency, they are distorting the past?
I think there are a variety of motivations. It's not always intentional. That is definitely part of it. You get people in the pseudoarchaeology business, and oftentimes it is a business that I would say are grifters and they're cons, and they know what they're saying is wrong. But you also get a lot of people who are genuinely curious, who like the fantasy aspect of it, who want to live in and believe in a world that is maybe different or more exciting than the world that they see in front of them. So they're kind of vulnerable to those kind of ideas and claims, and that helps kind of feed this wheel that keeps going around and around. And a lot of these ideas have been around for a very long time, for hundreds of years since the beginning.
Oh, come on, Dr. White. When we know that aliens built the pyramids. There's no way human beings could have done this. It had to have been extraterrestrials that they landed. And I've seen Stargate. You know what I'm saying? I know. I'm going to come back to the pyramids in just a second and ancient aliens for sure. But I want to talk about this. I guess it was a quiz you gave to a live audience at the University of Southern Indiana. It made me feel really smart because you had a list of questions that you asked the audience that Aristotle had answered in his life.
If I gave you a quiz, which I'm going to do with a few questions on it, we'll see how smart you are and how smart Aristotle is. The Earth is at the center of the universe. True or false? False. You are correct. The organ used for thinking is the heart or the brain. Some animals spontaneously generate from the mud. That's false. All things are composed of air, water, earth, and or fire. False. The lungs serve to cool the body. You're a little bit unsure about that one, but you know that it's false. Aristotle would have answered every single one of those wrong. It doesn't mean that you are smarter than him. That means that you benefit from the 500 years of inquiry into the natural world that has been done during the modern era. We know a lot about the world, and it's because of science. It's not because of guessing.
Well, so I used to use that example with my students. We, where we are sitting today, benefit from hundreds of years in the modern period of scientific inquiry, of people using trial and error and theory and induction and deduction to try to figure out how the natural world works. So you and I know things that would have been complete mysteries to the ancient Greeks. And so I like to give this quiz where I basically demonstrate to people that they know more about the natural world than Aristotle. They are almost certainly, well, I can't say for sure, but most people in the audience are probably not smarter than Aristotle, but they benefit from this cumulative production of knowledge that science gives us. That's actual science. So I think it helps people to understand that getting things wrong and having an idea and testing it are kind of central to the scientific method. And in a lot of ways, we live our lives like that every day through trial and error and through building up a cumulative knowledge of the way things work.
Well, the downside of that is with this plethora of knowledge, the wealth of information and the information era, it's also the misinformation, the disinformation era. It's chaos out there. It's the Wild West, right?
It is. I think the internet has a lot to do with that. There's a really interesting period in history in the 1800s, as a lot of new science and technology was coming online, where there was a great and growing interest in the occult and magic. You know, as we were learning about electricity and magnetism, and we were getting better telescopes and able to kind of look outside of the Earth more and look inside the Earth with geology and things like that, and trying to understand deep time. So a lot of these observations were incorporated into kind of magical or supernatural explanations of the world, and you get all these secret societies and things like that. But as technology progresses, what we need to attribute to magic and the supernatural keeps getting winnowed away, right? So more and more we can explain things in a way that we can understand through observation, through science, and physically touch and hold and observe. But now with the internet, I feel like there's kind of a new dimension of the spread of information, and there's no good set of filters. So it really has brought new life into a lot of these ideas. Things that we have known for a very long time are wrong about the world we live in today and about the way the past played out. But it doesn't seem to matter. There's no way to stop this flow of nonsense other than, I think, to teach people how to think critically and evaluate things and scrutinize on their own. And so that's one of the things that I like to try to teach my students. I think it's a skill that is sorely lacking in our country today. And if you look at the results of the last election and what is continuing to happen, I don't think you really need to look any farther than that.
No, I've wondered if perhaps we deserve the killer asteroid, but that's a whole other conversation. So I mentioned the pyramids. Mm-hmm. Give me examples, if you would. I mean, I hate to put you on the spot, but this is your wheelhouse. Give me some examples, specific examples of conspiracies or pseudo-history, pseudoscience, pseudo-archaeology that you have had to address recently.
Well, I mean, we can start with the pyramids. Everybody's heard of the pyramids. Everybody knows about the pyramids. If you Google the pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids, you will find some good information, and you also find hundreds and hundreds of repetitions of the same kind of set of wrong facts or conclusions about how they could not possibly have been built, that we have no evidence of how the ancient Egyptians built them, that they encode secrets about the earth and their dimensions and their proportions, that they are aligned to the cardinal directions with a precision that would be impossible for us to duplicate today, that we could not move the rocks that it took to build the Great Pyramid. And all of these things are nonsense. If you scratch the surface, you can pretty quickly figure that out. It's not to take away from the pyramids. They are fantastic, interesting constructions, and there's a reason why they're one of the wonders of the world that still exist. But it doesn't mean that the ancient Egyptians couldn't build them. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence of how they did just that. But there's this kind of drive to point to them and say those structures should not exist, that we can't possibly explain it any other way. And now, people will laughingly say, oh, the pyramids were built by aliens. We all know that. Before the ancient aliens was a thing, which really was a post-World War II phenomenon where we started seeing UFOs, and then all of a sudden the ancient past is, filled with aliens. Earlier than that, it had to be white people, because there's no way that dark-skinned people could have built these constructions, because white people are the only ones capable of civilization. And so that's the kind of, if you follow the history back and the intellectual ancestry of these ideas, like that's where you're led time and time again, that a lot of these ideas came about as justifications for colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and a lot of pretty ugly stuff.
So you're saying that there is a sinister element attached. It's not just bubble gum. Oh, come on. We all know it's, even if people think it's aliens, it's harmless. You're saying that there are actually some layers under the top that need to be addressed. Yeah.
And, I wouldn't say that everybody that everybody that believes the ancient astronaut theory is automatically a racist. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But if you make a diagram of people who believe in Atlantis and ancient aliens and everything else, and then you have another overlapping circle that is white supremacists, the white supremacists almost all know and believe that stuff. Hitler and Himmler, they loved Atlantis and ancient Aryans and things like that. It was central to their philosophy. If I were going to embrace an idea that was an explanation for the human past, like, I would want to vet that somewhat and know where those ideas are coming from. And I would want to know who my bedfellows were. So not only can we show factually that these things are wrong, but you can look at where these ideas come from. And if you are operating outside of the scientific framework, there's no way to test those ideas. And so it actually does matter where they come from. And the stuff about Atlantis really kicks off in the late 1800s. And it's racist to its core. And I'm not talking about, the Disney Atlantis with the Little Mermaid and stuff like that. Like, I'm talking about this idea that there was a sunken continent that was the mother civilization for all other civilizations around the world, and that continent had to have been populated by Aryans because they are the ones who are capable of civilization, and that would trickle down to the rest of the world. So they were responsible for the civilizations in Central America, rather than the Maya or the Aztec. They're responsible for the Inca civilization rather than the Incans. They're responsible for ancient Sumer. They're responsible for Egypt. And they're responsible for stuff in Europe and any place else where people were able to stack stones. That had to be white folks. That's the idea. And that idea gained popularity along with this continued need to disenfranchise people that were being subjugated by colonial powers.
To make sure that I'm tracking, two things. First, you're not saying everybody who has held to this conspiracy theory is in league with Hitler. You're not saying that.
Can't say
sort
that.
of the Venn diagram. There's some overlap as to what they believed, but you're not making that blanket statement. But what I'm hearing is the Egyptians could not have built the pyramids because only white people were advanced enough intellectually to have had the technology to do it. Therefore, aliens. Was that the claim?
Yeah, so you're missing a few dots in there, but that's basically it. If you go
back...
well,
fill the dots for me. Go ahead.
Okay, so people have known about the pyramids for a long time. Like, they've always been exposed, so Europeans knew about them. But Egyptology really starts when Napoleon invades France around 1800 or so. People start studying Egypt. They find depictions of all kinds of different races and ethnicities in ancient Egypt. People with light skin, with dark skin, with very dark skin. The racists in the world cannot justify white supremacy and have a civilization that is as grand as ancient Egypt was not have been built by white people. So they look at those pictures and they say, obviously, these are the builders and the rest of these people are the slaves or whatever. It's always seen through kind of a lens of, in your hierarchy of societies, you have to put the ones built by white Europeans on top. And this is part of the whole colonial enterprise that was ongoing from the 1500s to the 1900s, say. That idea gets expanded as people discover other ancient civilizations around the world, like those in India, ancient India, in the Indus Valley, and in Central America, South America, and even in North America. So eventually there needs to be an explanation, in their view, for how white people are responsible for all the rest of those also. And that's where Atlantis comes in as a geographical area where there would have been a white civilization, and it's now submerged, which is very convenient because we can't go do any, poking around and looking there because it's beneath the Atlantic Ocean. And it's that same package of ideas. All you have to do is replace Atlantis and ancient Aryans with aliens, and you've got the ancient astronaut theory. It's all the same. The local people could not have built this. There's all of these things that don't fit. There's white gods and, stuff that can only be seen from the air. So there's a layer added onto it, but it's essentially the Atlantis is responsible for civilization throughout the world trope, just with a tie to outer space. That's it in a nutshell.
Dr. White, do you sit down and watch the History Channel? I mean, are you there? Are you binging and sponging and then making notes on the History Channel?
When I first started doing this about 10 years ago, actively, I watched more of those programs, but it tends to be the same thing over and over again. And I've got 2 kids and a real job.
There is nothing new under the sun. Well, they do a lot of the Hitler and the occult shows. We talk a lot about, Hitler and his weaponization of religion, whether it's Christianity / Catholicism, etc. But he did have some ties to the occult. Can you flesh that out?
Yeah. I've actually got.
I know it's a broad question.
No,
you don't have to answer it, but
I can give it a shot. So,
okay,
once you get, and you've talked about enough of this stuff that once you get into the occult and secret societies, it is a maze of rabbit holes.
Oh God, yes.
To go down.
Yes.
It's awful. So like I've got a book that'll probably arrive today on the occult and the Nazis, and I've been reading up on Vril and Blavatsky and Theosophy and what that has to do with the Nazis. So yeah, like I read and I take notes, but I cannot connect all of those dots for you. One of the things about secret societies is they're supposed to be secret. So I think sometimes it's hard to tell fact from fiction. An interesting thing about the Nazi connection to me is that, like, if you look at Ancient Aliens, they swallow hook, line, and sinker, not only that Hitler and the Nazis were interested in the occult, but that they actually had these supernatural powers from the aliens. So it's kind of like they're buying into the propaganda a little bit in a way that I think is kind of shocking and horrifying. You know, I think it's one thing to study it as a subject, but if you are studying it as a subject because you think it's real and there's something to the ancient Aryan master race, you know, then it becomes a lot more problematic. So I'm interested in it from a, say, like an objective, you know, historical, like trying to understand the context of these ideas. But I think a lot of the believers in ancient aliens will go several steps beyond that into like thinking that maybe they actually did discover these, you know, supernatural sources of power, and maybe they came from outer space. Or
to me, I'm hearing that the idea then is it's kind of like Indiana Jones. Hitler was really, according to shows like Ancient Aliens, was really on a quest for the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail and all those types of things. They're selling this as, if not science fact, as a distinct possibility.
Yeah, and I mean, you will see that, and that may be the most accurate part of the Indiana Jones movies. that Hitler was into that stuff. He was looking for relics. They were looking for sources of power. But again, you know, I'm not an expert on all of the ins and outs, so it's harder for me to, I think, authoritatively separate fact from fiction and what these secret societies really were and what they really believed. But that's those are the notions that are out there, that they were so into this stuff and this occult stuff because of the way it tied into ancient Aryans and the master race and where those qualities of the master race came from and how they could reproduce it. And trying to kind of synthesize, which is what a lot of the occult and theosophy does, like synthesize like a religion or a philosophy from all of the different kinds of spirituality and mysticism. You know, you take stuff from Hindus and Hinduism and Tibet and, you know, ancient esoteric symbols on the pyramids, and you can tie all this together. And as long as you can point towards that being related to why Aryans are awesome and they should take over the world again, you know, you just embrace it. There's not a mechanism for saying, well, you know, maybe the Bible isn't true. You know, maybe there is no Ark of the Covenant. Like that wasn't, I don't think that was the mindset. It was very much a pseudoscientific world that they were operating in.
It's a classic conundrum, isn't it? Where conspiracy theories are easy to brush off, but the fact that history has had more than its share of actual conspiracies primes us maybe to lean more into even absurd claims. Well, conspiracies have happened throughout human history. Why would this be impossible? And I think that it's almost like the fog of war. You're trying to find your way around to see it, to separate the wheat from the chaff, if I may draw from the Bible. Can you tell me about the Ancient Aliens guy? I've seen the meme, guy with the wild hair. Aliens is the text on the meme, but I don't know much about him. Who is this guy?
Oh, I don't know much about him either. I mean, he's an entertainer. His name is Georgios Tsoukalos. He's the wild hair is probably intentional because he's a TV star. He is kind of the second wave. Eric von Daniken in the 1960s was the one that really popularized ancient aliens theory. He wrote the book Chariots of the Gods. And that's, you know, that was a phenomena. They got an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary for that movie, which is ridiculous looking back on it, but that happened. And it was a big deal. And he connected all the dots worldwide with ancient civilizations and you know, mythology, archaeology, the occult, and UFO stuff. he did a good job doing it because he sold a lot of copies. He made himself famous. And he has kind of passed that mantle on now. Ancient Aliens, the TV show, has been on for over 10 years. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But Tsoukalos, the guy with the hair, is kind of it seems to be the apparent figurehead, kind of the heir apparent to Von Daniken. And he's good at what he does of getting on TV and talking and seeming convincing. Whether he actually believes any of that stuff, I have no idea. No idea.
At the very least, he's good at branding because we're all talking about him and we all know who he is. Yeah. Can we talk about, you say, and correct me if I got it wrong, throughout history, most of, if not all of the world's worst atrocities have been imbued with these types of conspiracy theories, aliens, the occult, etc. Did I hear that right?
I would say that pseudoscience and human atrocities walk hand in hand. And we have multiple examples of that. So I wouldn't say that everything that goes wrong in the world is related, to these specific kind of particular examples. But like if you look at, the justifications for slavery, a lot of those came from incorrect answers to how do we explain human variability? What does human variability mean? Why do some people have dark skin and different hair than others? And what kind of significance do we attach to that? And if you take a pseudoscientific approach to it, you can come up with any answer that you want to. And the answer that they came up with was that these are lesser people. These are subhumans. There were multiple creations. God did not just create, Adam and Eve and we're all related. Like there was something else that happened, and that's polygenism. And that was absolutely fundamental to the justification of slavery, at least in North America, which is the example that I know because that's where I'm from. If you look at things like the Holocaust and the Nazis in general, pseudoscience is everywhere in that. And it's all about, constructing a narrative of the human past that articulates with, resonates with, and justifies your agenda, whatever that is. And it worked for slavery. It worked for the Holocaust. It worked for the removal of Native Americans, the Native American genocide that went on in this country in the early 1800s, where most Native American peoples from Eastern North America were dispossessed and forcibly moved westward to make room for the growing United States. That had to do with, the pre-contact Native American societies, which is what I study and have been for 30 years, created an incredible landscape filled with sophisticated architecture, earthen architecture, all over Eastern North America. They're earthen mounds. So as European settlers moved in and cleared forests and farmed and started finding these mounds, it became a problem because if you have very sophisticated structures, those are signs of civilization. So who were the people that built these mounds? Well, they couldn't have possibly been the Native Americans, because if they were, then that would make them a civilized people and we have no business pushing them out. So this thing called the mound builder myth emerged, where there was a separate earlier civilization that was before the Native Americans that built all these mounds. And therefore, the Native Americans have no more claim to this land than the white Europeans do. And it's okay for us just to push them out because they are unrelated to the civilization that was there before. Total pseudoscience. We know, and we knew at the time from archaeologists, very early archaeology, digging into those mounds, that they were the products of Native American cultures, but it didn't matter. And in fact, if you go look at the speeches of Andrew Jackson, who was the president who was most famous for pushing Native Americans out of the eastern part of the country, he cites the relics of this long forgotten race, the mounds, and it has to do with, I don't know if you've heard claims about giant skeletons being found in mounds. It's all data points, or I would say fake data points, that people use to separate Native Americans from their history so that they are a savage people and not a civilized people. And I'm using the Victorian era terms for that. I wouldn't actually use those terms in order to dispossess them and push them out. And that was one of the two great, original sins of this country, that and slavery. And both of those had to do with an intentionally incorrect or blind interpretation of the human past that did not articulate at all with facts and evidence or any kind of genuine desire to understand. And that's a problem.
So to make sure I'm understanding, are you saying that the History Channel's broadcasts of shows like Ancient Aliens isn't just bubblegum entertainments, even if they're sincere and they sincerely got it wrong. This becomes a moral affront because they are essentially selling stuff that's laced with atrocity, division, bigotry, racism, etc.
I would say at the very least, it's irresponsible. It's entertainment, so it's for the money, and I get that. But let me come at it this way. When I was first started being a professional archaeologist, I've always been interested in these kinds of ideas and claims since I was a kid. I grew up on In Search Of and other programs like that. I was into the unexplained mysteries stuff, so I get it. As I became more and more aware of the actual human past and how we know about it and using scientific methods and things like that, I had my mentors who were older would tell me, don't talk about that stuff. Don't engage with it. You're wasting your time. You're making it worse by giving them oxygen. If you look at polling, like actual polling data by Chapman University, there's something like, I want to say it's half of the country believes in Atlantis now, and maybe a third believes in visits by ancient aliens. And they ask all kinds of questions, down into Bigfoot and lizard people and other stuff. But I think those numbers are a sign that our strategy of not engaging with these ideas has not worked. And the fact that these ideas have these submerged kind of white supremacist, us versus them themes that have been running through them for hundreds of years means they are not harmless. And it doesn't take very much scratching to find out that even if everybody who believes in Atlantis is not a white supremacist, that most white supremacists believe in Atlantis. And a lot of people who are putting out the books and who are active online, there's one guy who's got the Nazi eagle as his, like self-published publishing house logo on his books. And it's all about Aryans and UFOs and Atlantis and stuff like that. And so when you have shows on mainstream television that are feeding that narrative and legitimizing it and making it glamorous and kind of bringing it into the culture in a way that is socially acceptable, that is troubling to me. And it doesn't matter whether the talking heads on Ancient Aliens even know or understand where these ideas come from, but they are feeding it and pandering in a lot of ways to this base that does understand the implications. And so, yeah, I think it's irresponsible. And if I were them, I would be ashamed of myself, honestly.
I grew up listening to a late night AM radio show with a guy named Art Bell. And if you heard the name Art Bell, he had all kinds of, it was always alien. And I never escaped the idea that he was just full of it. Like he may have believed, but I really felt like he just knew his shtick and he knew how to get ratings. And we're still talking about him long after his death, but he was always UFOs and the aliens built the pyramids and secret chambers of the Illuminati type stuff. And, and he was popular. We tend to be primed for conspiracies. We love a good story. And the idea that the Egyptians hauled a bunch of rocks and stacked them is not nearly as sexy as extraterrestrials visited us and put it all together and maybe left us some technology. That's another one, right? The reason we have some of the technologies we have now is that the aliens sort of gave us the starter pack. Did I read that right?
Yeah. I mean, again, the show's been on the air for over 10 years now. So
I'm not saying it was just the show saying it, but there are beliefs out there that the reason that we were able to develop things like Wi-Fi and satellite technology is because at some point the elements were given to us, at least in basic form, to build on. So I don't know if you'd heard those or not.
Yeah. And again, that is an adaptation of a very old idea. So, cultures share information between them. Ideas, technologies, that's called diffusion, right? An idea can go from one culture to another by any number of means. If you put the white supremacist spin on it, and this is historical, They would call it hyperdiffusionism. And then the assumption is that technologies and ideas always flow in one direction, from the superior to the inferior. So they come from civilized people down to the savages, or they come from the aliens down to us. So there's this kind of directional arrow, and that becomes like part and parcel. And you see arguments about, people saying that our societies in the Holocene 10,000 years ago couldn't even have come up with the idea of agriculture without some super civilized Ice Age society or aliens or whatever teaching us about the idea of how to plant things. And anybody who does any kind of anthropological research or anything knows that's total garbage. But that's kind of what's out there. So you look at new technologies and well, where did that come from? I don't understand it myself. It must have come from, something else. But, one of the great things about having this longitudinal perspective that we have is we can actually trace all these things out. A guy figured out in the 1830s that electricity and magnetism were connected together, that if you moved a magnet through a coil of wires, you would produce a current. Michael Faraday figured that out in 1825. At the time, it was magic. You couldn't see the magnetic field. You couldn't see the electric field. Nobody understood how these things worked. And then, from there, we can come up with things like telegraph and telephones. We can send current through wires. All this stuff was impossible. Does anybody now say that was, the aliens that taught us how to do that? Because we can look at all the steps and see where it came from. And the same thing goes with agriculture. We can see for thousands of years, people domesticating plants slowly. We can study it. We can look at it. We know. But it's sexier to go the 5G, that's got to be aliens, right? It's got to be. And the contrails coming out of the jet engines, those are chemicals and they're controlling the weather. I mean, sure, that's better, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know. It's people. I was at Dunning. I was saying people talk about intelligent life out there, and I'm a little nervous about intelligent life down here. And I've had my share of bad ideas. I think we all have, right? And this idea that smart people can't be fooled, that's totally bogus. I'm sure you bumped into a lot of very, very intelligent people who had that series of boxes in their brain. Maybe they'd compartmentalized some horrible ideas. You would agree with that, right? I mean, there's some brilliant people who can believe stupid stuff.
Sure. And I think that archaeology is particularly vulnerable to that, because it's hard for us to explain how we know what we know, because I wasn't there, you weren't there. So does that mean that your idea about aliens, and not you, but a person's idea about aliens building the pyramids is, just as valid as the Egyptologist who studied it for 20 years and has all kinds of evidence, because nobody was there, so we're not really sure which one is correct. So it's hard. So yeah, I run into doctors and dentists and lawyers who, when I tell them I'm an archaeologist, they want to talk about aliens building the pyramids. My dad was an engineer. For 30 years, he had a rock that he found that he swore was a tool because it fit nicely in your hand. And you would not, if I had $1 for every time somebody told me about a rock that fit nicely in their hand, he would not believe me. Even after I'd gotten my PhD in archaeology, he would not believe me that was nothing. It's not a tool. So the way we have to learn about the past, humans are really, really tough to study in the present. Try studying them in the past. And it's not like we're studying a crime scene that, a series of events that occurred half an hour ago or 3 hours ago. We're just talking about stuff that is a really impoverished record of human behavior from thousands and thousands of years ago. It's really hard to get at that human behavior, which is what we want to study. So not only is it hard to do it, it's hard to explain to people how we know what we know and why we're more confident in some explanations than others, and how we separate, I'll use your analogy, the wheat from the chaff. And that's a lot of fertile ground for, well, then anybody can just propose, any idea about the past, and they're all fine. It would be insane if I went to a biologist and I said, well, I know you've studied this for a long time and you have all kinds of data, but I'm going to tell you about a much better taxonomy for horses than you, because I had an idea about this and you weren't there. You didn't see those horses evolve. If I went to an astronomer and I gave them my theory of, how the universe should be, as an outsider, I don't have any of that expertise. It's a very weak argument, though, to tell somebody that you should believe what I'm saying because I've been to school and I've studied this a lot. So we need to be able to explain how we know what we know. And that's a tough job for archaeologists. And it's an especially tough job when you have your mentors and a lot of people around you saying, don't waste your time on that. But if we don't waste our time on that, then we get 50% of the population believing in Atlantis. And guess what? They can elect any president they want.
So rather than just write it off and say it's a waste of time, you would engage. If there's bunkers out there, you would engage.
Yeah, and you can't do it in a serial fashion. I can't go out and convince every person that I meet and have a one-on-one argument. So my strategy has been to create resources online so that they are findable. If people are actually curious or they want a different perspective on something having to do with the pyramids or, you name it, giants. I used to write a lot of stuff about claims about ancient giants, which are another thing that ties into the Bible. There has to be something for them to find. I cannot individually convince people one by one on Facebook. Those arguments are often take a lot of energy and you don't convince anybody but if somebody is really curious and they can go and they can find a YouTube video or a blog post or something, go, oh, you know what? That makes a whole lot more sense to me now. So we need to have voices out there or resources out there that will provide an alternative to the pseudoscience stuff, which is it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's on cable TV. It's online and social media and so many different forms. So I encourage all archaeologists who kind of see that point to get off the bench a little bit and do something. It's not my job. I don't get paid to do this stuff anymore like I did when I was teaching it. So I do it on the weekends, in the evenings when I have time. But I think that's what you can do, and if you are serious about getting the human past right and communicating with the public and trying to help people understand what archaeology actually is and how we know what we know, then we need those voices out there.
That's a perfect punctuation mark for the end of our conversation. Where would they find resources like this? I know people in my audience are interested in tooling up for these conversations. Where would you send them?
So, I have my own YouTube channel. I'm pretty easy to find. Right now, the name of it is Nobody Listens to Andrew, which is named after a book that I had as a kid because I was the younger sibling and I always felt like nobody listened to me at all. And as a Generation Xer, I don't like to be branded as one certain thing. So I talk about a bunch of different stuff on my YouTube channel, but a lot of it is related to pseudoarchaeology and pseudoscience. There's a group on Facebook now, Fraudulent Archaeology Wall of Shame. It has 133. That's right. I started that group. I don't know how many, maybe 10 years ago. And it was just me. So I was the first and only member for a while. But I realized that there were so many of these pseudoarchaeology platforms that were just spreading nonsense. So it was a place for professional archaeologists to come together and talk about stuff and share information. And it has since grown to over 100,000 members now. So that's a good source. People will help you find specific answers to things there if you post there. There are a lot of people who blog and who do YouTube videos, too many to mention, but they're out there and they're findable in a they're much more findable than they were, say, 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago. So that gives me a little bit of hope. Actually, one of the largest purveyors of pseudoarchaeology, Graham Hancock, had a Netflix series on last year, which was hugely popular. Hugely. He has a big following. He's very well spoken. He's written a lot of books. He's into the Atlantis stuff, not the aliens stuff. But he appears on the Joe Rogan podcast, which I think is like the largest, the most viewed podcast on YouTube. Yeah, it's huge. It's got millions of views. And he finally got an archaeologist on there to debate him, a guy by the name of Flint Dibble. And I thought Flint mopped the floor with him. It took 4.5 hours. But, that's what happens. So one thing that pseudoarchaeology does is it tries to insulate itself from scrutiny. They don't necessarily want to engage. So when you do, you get a variety of reactions, some angry. I've been threatened with lawsuits for calling people out on stuff that was obviously false. And but when you have truth on your side, it's pretty easy to be confident.
Well,
So
I will.
go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I just
the old man rambles on and on. Yeah.
No. Well, you got a host and a communicator in the same room, and And I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'll link to your YouTube channel and the awesomely named Facebook page, which I may borrow part of that for the title of our conversation. But thanks for your great work and for bringing to my attention something that I had never thought of before. To me, it was always just kind of, oh, come on, it's wacky, it's weird. It's, it's even stupid, the ideas being stupid, but I never thought that they were all that sinister, except for maybe priming people to think in conspiratorial ways. They say that like religious children, and I'm biased here because I came out of a hardcore high control Christianity, but when you program young people to think in magical terms, it's harder for them to tether themselves to reality as they get older. And that's what I thought the big problem was. I had no idea that there were white supremacy ties to these types of things. So,
none of these ideas come out of thin air. Like they all have a history and a context. And when you start going back in it, like it can get pretty ugly and pretty disturbing pretty quickly. As an academic, like I'm interested in that. Like I like to understand the history of ideas and thought and that sort of thing. But it's not pleasant. It's not a nice world to be in.
It's necessary and it's appreciated. Dr. Andrew White, you've been generous with your time today. Thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you.